we're streaming live. You are up, Jeff.
Hey, welcome everyone to Your Bites, Your Rights, a weekly interdisciplinary discussion and podcast about data ownership, digital rights, and your privacy. Episode 37, we go open mic. I'm Jeff Jokish, founder of Privacy Plan and a local data privacy researcher. I live at the intersection of uh, data privacy and data about data privacy. I think I screwed that up pretty well. I'm here with my co-host, Christian Kmeyer. He's a managing partner at Sustany Capital. Chris runs a venture firm that's focused on blockchain solutions. As a former software developer and lawyer, he's been working on data rights, the future of money, and recreating reality consensus. How do we go about doing that, Chris? Creating reality consensus.
Well, it's a long and arduous process that I started 14 years ago. I started to write an outline and then naively try to implement a bunch of different solutions, finance a bunch of different solutions, ultimately came to the conclusion that it's going to be a much longer process. Right now, I'm hoping to get it done in about 20 years, and that's probably ambitious. But how are we going to go about that? Well, we need to change the topology of what we call the World Wide Web today, which I call the digital landfill. As in, to simplify this massively, we need to change the direction from being this push model to a pull model, to where we actually get to set the agenda for what we want to do with the technology that we are engaging with. And at that point in time, we'll be liberated from the current model of social engineering as a service, where you're always a non-player character in whatever platform you're engaging with. But yeah, that first requires education and awareness, and then requires people that are in the position of making changes to apply that knowledge. And that's what we're trying to do on a daily basis throughout our different think tanks, working groups. Interesting enough, the simplest problem to solve is all the money in the world, and that's what we focus on. And they're specifically what people call money, or really currency's primary function is that of language, right? So
Yeah.
a language of value, and unless you can come to an agreement over that, no commercial activity can take place, right? If you insist on speaking dollars and I insist on speaking Pokemons or Bitcoin, then no transaction can occur. But that's largely not recognized by people that use this for other purposes. End of preliminary sermon. There's going to be more as
Yeah.
usual.
Well, I think to change that topology, we really we have to own our bits, right? We have to own our bytes, and we have to own our identity. Um, so, we're going to have Tom Basor join us here in a moment. He's running a couple of minutes late, but I'd like to talk real quickly before we bring some people up on stage about one thing that I think is going to have some impact, and that is new privacy legislation that has teeth, right? And we've seen over the past few years privacy laws go into effect that have woken up corporate America. First, GDPR came out, and I think one of the things that really set it apart from other privacy laws, other than being, comprehensive and having quite a bit of, just substance to it, was the fact that it had a big number behind it, and that was 4% of your global turnover. 4% of essentially your profitability for a year was the potential fine. Now, I haven't actually seen, I think, that 4% ever levied, but it's a potential stick that scares a lot of companies and has gotten a lot of companies to actually abide by those privacy laws. So, but the Australian privacy law that was just passed a couple of days ago ups that ante considerably. And so, if you haven't heard about this yet, the new Australian privacy law has some interesting pieces in it, and the penalties are what's most important. They essentially have three different things that it could be. So you can find the greater of any of these three things. One is $50 million Australian. The second is the value of, I'm actually reading a different one here. I'll read this one. 3 times the value of the benefit derived by the company from the data breach, right? Which is, I think, a unique way to think about it. I haven't seen that in any other laws. And the third one is 30% of the company's adjusted turnover. 30%, not 4% or 5% or 6%. And I think there was a couple of bills that even proposed going up to 10%, but 30% of turnover. So that's just an incredible increase in the potential fines that could be levied against a company. And you'll note that this actually seems to focus primarily on data breaches. So it's not necessarily on all privacy fines from what I'm reading into this, but primarily on breaches. This is a big change, a pretty big stick for companies.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, in principle, that's how all fines and fees should be structured, right? Because, I mean, what we've seen over decades now, that a lot of companies can write off these kind of fines as cost of doing business. Just thinking about the settlement that Facebook had with the state of Illinois for $650 million. A lot of companies would be out of business, needless to say, if they had to pay a $650 million fine. For Facebook's was essentially immaterial. But really what we need is to make the damages that they're incurring to third parties compensate with the actual fines that you apply. I mean, the examples that we discussed earlier in some countries in Europe, the speeding tickets are not generalized, so that you don't pay the same fine if someone makes more money. You pay a higher fine that's based on your income. And so you're thinking then twice. I mean, there specifically, as you know, I disagree. I think people should drive as fast as they can all the time. But other than that, if it comes to my personal property, including my bytes, which I consider my personal property, and you cannot protect them, you do not protect them, and they get stolen, then I have an immediate damage as far as I'm concerned that you need to compensate me for without me doing anything, by the way. That should be immediate, just like you're stealing from me. There should be immediate consequences compensatory to the number of breaches that there are and through the amount of data that's been stolen and the revenue that you glean from that. And as you know, I don't even consider the use case of most of data legitimate to begin with, right? They shouldn't be storing it to begin with. And I think there's a huge argument to be made that if you cannot protect it, you shouldn't be storing it. That's kind of the first, actually the second step. The first step is always ask yourself if you should even collect this data, if you even should store the data, if you should even create the data to begin with. And I think in that particular circumstance, people that fall under that particular regulation and these new fines, they will think twice now, right? So that will really make you think, and that's what we need. We need to rethink this current paradigm. It's simply not sustainable and hasn't been sustainable. I think we're still by and large not at all accounting for the actual damages that people experience every day, and that could be as something as simple as simply just wasting people's time, which I consider damage more than anything else, because you cannot replace any time. You can replace most physical goods and most assets, but you can never ever replace a person's time. So I don't see any justification for doing that and not actually compensating people for that. And that's I probably in my life reviewed more than 10,000 pitch decks in technology context, and initially a lot in the ad tech space, and their time on site is a very, very important KPI. But what's less or never discussed is, well, how is that time actually being allocated on the, let's call it, victim side or the profiles side? And in my opinion, by and large, that time is just wasted.
Absolutely.
As in, I was engaging with a certain digital technology for a particular outcome. I wanted to elicit some particular knowledge, particular information. But in the pursuit of that, my attention is being derailed simply by the fact that someone has an overwhelming amount of information on my typical behavior and current state. And that, to me, has never been justifiable. We're going to welcome Thomas.
Hi guys, what's going on?
You tell me.
Hello from sunny Florida.
Hey, Tom. We're talking about the new Australian privacy law. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's got some crazy new enforcement fines.
Yeah, who's going to be the first target? Facebook, Twitter, Google?
Well, I don't know. If Facebook had to pay 30% of their annual turnover, I think Mark Zuckerberg might be in trouble.
Has anybody ever been tagged with anything even remotely approaching a percentage of their global revenue stream, even under the GDPR or otherwise? I mean, we do see a lot of significant fines coming out of the GDPR on a pretty routine basis, but I've never ever seen any substantive fine approaching the percentage of global revenue that they talk about. And I don't, to be honest with you, I don't know if they'd be able to enforce that, if it's more of a scare tactic or what. What do you think of that?
I don't think. I think you're correct that it hasn't happened yet. I think it's more of a scare tactic.
Well, it depends on who is going to be on the other side. At this moment in time in history, I don't think a lot of the social media companies have a lot of friends anywhere. Right? So that's ultimately what it always comes down to. Do you basically have friends in the regulatory landscape or in law enforcement? They will protect you ultimately from the outcomes that these laws can inflict on you.
It's going to happen though. Somebody's going to get hit. It's probably going to be somebody who doesn't have a lot of friends. You know.
I'm not so sure about this. I don't know, maybe I'm a skeptic or a cynic about it all, but I think a lot of this is privacy theater, a lot of theatrics going on, public relations, governments trying to, show that they're progressive and protecting privacy. But I really don't know that they've got the backing, the resources to actually tag somebody to those amounts. And, forget about the major social media players. What about the mom and pop stores, or not even mom and pop stores? There's some significant enterprises that are using data in a way that's been declared illegal and unjust. And I have yet to see them target any of those. And you know that they're going. And when I say target, I mean the 4%, or if Australia wants to go after 30% of somebody's revenue. I would love to see that. That would be a great. I'd love a front row seat for that.
Yeah. Well, I just did the quick math, by the way. When Facebook paid that $5 billion civil penalty in 2019, that was just under 10% of the revenue that year.
Who is this?
Facebook, the FTC settlement, that was just under 10% of the revenue if you did the math.
And they just got tagged again by the Irish DPC, another GDPR fine. It keeps happening over and over again. Well, I think they need to hire some privacy pros.
Well, what I think is that they need to go after the executives personally, right? Those people that knew of these outcomes. I don't think it's because what you're really doing by extension is you're penalizing the shareholders, and to the extent that the shareholders have limited influence over the company, they should be penalized, right? So that's true for Facebook. Yeah. So you really need to look behind the curtain and where it's necessary pierce the veil and reach through to the executive if you actually are serious about wanting to see change, right? As far as I'm concerned, and I've said this hundreds of times, Mark Zuckerberg belongs in prison, right?
But that's not part of the law. They don't target the executives. They target the 4% of the global revenue.
There are personal liability laws in several privacy laws. Singapore has actually got some personal liability. There is some personal liability in several other laws, and I think those things are coming. We're seeing more of that. It hasn't happened in a lot of the major laws, certainly no U.S. laws. I think there may be personal liability in one or two state data breach laws, but it's not very often you see that in U.S. law yet. But I think it's coming. I think we're not going to see any major change until we do see personal liability. I think Chris is right about that.
Well, that'll be interesting. As we all know, it's kind of a day-by-day thing. It seems like every day there's a new breach, there's a new enforcement action. I'm particularly interested to see when they go after some of these secondary, tertiary enterprises, not the Facebooks, not the Twitter, not the Google. If they start going after some of these other enterprises in a significant way, numerically, when they start filing dozens of lawsuits, whether it comes out of California or the Europeans or whatever. But it seems right now they're just doing targeting poster children, trying to raise awareness is what I can only assume they're trying to do, because there's no shortage of low-hanging fruit.
Right.
Every day we see stuff happening.
Yeah, ultimately.
Well, it's a good point, Tom. I mean, why exactly are they going after Kachava, right? A little data broker in Idaho, rather than going after one of the huge data brokers that's actually making $1 billion a year?
That's a great example of the tertiary enterprises I'm talking about. And if you've been following that case, it's just crazy. They're trying to establish a poster child. The back and forth between the FTC and Kachava, they were trying to do the right thing, trying to negotiate a good faith settlement, but no, wham, bam, all of a sudden they're on the news. And I'm particularly interested to see how that goes, because Kachava filed a motion to dismiss that lawsuit, and now the other day the FTC replied. Of course, we don't have a decision yet, but I think that would be really fascinating if that suit gets dismissed, because I don't think in the complaint the FTC was clear enough in identifying the specific law that was broken, other than the general Article 5, unfair trade practices. But certainly was a lack of notice as to the offending behavior. And Kachava is being used as a poster child. There's dozens more Kachavas, and why is it that they're singling out that one enterprise? And the same could be said of the crypto space. To take this beyond privacy, why is XRP being targeted by the SEC? They're just trying to make a good PR value, and if they really feel strongly that these laws are enforceable, they should start enforcing them against everybody.
Oh, yeah, don't drag me down this particular rabbit hole. But XRP is clearly a scam, and I've said this forever. What's funny is, and then we really should put a lid on that topic, but there is actually a podcast where Brett Garlinghouse, the CEO of Ripple, basically states the only reason for XRP to exist is to pay Ripple $25 million a month. And there's no utility in that, and if you understand technology and the implementation of it, you know that there is absolutely no reason for it to exist. There's no utility. Anywho, but let's talk about data brokers instead. And yeah, piggybacking on what you said earlier, I think there's too many that hide in the shadows that don't really get a recognition for the damage that they do to the broader society on a daily basis. Right? The Axioms, the Experian, the Equifaxes of the world. As far as I'm concerned, these are criminal entities, always been, and would be, by the way, under most European laws. They couldn't exist, they couldn't do what they are doing, collecting personal, private financial information. That would be against the law in Germany. And also, the whole idea of rating, giving someone a credit score, that to me seems dehumanizing, and most countries don't have that. That's very specific to the United States, and obviously there are other mechanisms to establish a credit history. And then there's always this kind of false communication in that realm, where these entities then that use these services get to say they gave you credit. That is just semantically false. Credit is something that you have, right? It's not something that someone gives you. And it's very specific, right? So it's very specific to
So do you think that come January 1st, all these big data brokers are going to wipe Californians out of their database and start operating above the law, or do you think it's going to be business as usual?
It's going to be business as usual until the first one actually gets penalized to the extent that they won't survive. then they're gonna change. But it's actually, from a technical perspective, really, really complex. I mean, we've discussed it pretty much at length in the Twitter scenario. It's really complex to get data handling correct, because just think about the technology debt that these companies have and the way they're doing data recovery, the way they are copying and pasting this data to their backups and so forth. And we were just looking before our call here at the latest data breach of one of the largest password providers.
LastPass?
Yeah. And so there's this kind of cryptic press release. Well, even though there was a data breach, the hackers didn't get to personal identifiable data and passwords. It's like, okay, that's not very reassuring. It's like all you do, your entire business is to protect passwords, and you cannot even protect yourself.
Yeah, that was quite discouraging.
Yeah, and that's obviously not the first time that this is.
It's like the fourth breach they've had, the second in 3 months, right?
It comes back to it's cybersecurity by itself, by and large, is security theater. And the reason why it's security theater, because the current paradigm, the architecture of legacy database solutions is not suited to be safe, period, full stop. The way permissions layers are created around database solutions. I developed database solutions back in the 80s, and that was terrible back then, and today is like marginally better. But we looked at hundreds of different solutions that claim that protect data, but ultimately we'll always come back to the same. Well, you have to have the ability to access this data for certain solutions in some way. Unfortunately, some way usually includes the ability of an enormous amount of people working at these companies having wholesale access to that. Right? And the only way to change that is basically to wipe out the existing system and to start over. Right? And that's simply because of the way this data was created in the first place.
Yeah, I don't have high hopes that that's going to happen, that the system is, that people are going to start over. I know technology is evolving on an incremental basis. There's a lot of proposals to manage data better, to encrypt data, to hide data better, to not collect as much data, to collect a minimum amount and specific purposes involved. I mean, all the emotions are going through. A lot of it is privacy theater. But do you think over the course of time things will get better, or are we just in the Wild West?
Yes, no. I think it's inevitable, and the reason why is it's inevitable. And I work backwards from just observing how technology is actually being adopted. And so what I mean by that specifically, and that's my typical go-to examples, if you're seeing that certain government entities are now starting to issue digitally native credentials and are being more nuanced about how these can be exchanged with law enforcement specifically. So at that moment in time, you can actually then require, from a technology perspective, that you're applying these standards, what I call like just using mapped cryptographic primitives, as in just sharing the information that, not even sharing the information, but streaming access to information for a limited period of time for that particular purpose, with that particular, let's call it simplified timestamping mechanism attached to that. And so the metaphor I've been using for this for a long time is, what you want to do is recreate the scenario before we invented databases. So what were you using before we invented databases? If you wanted to use some nation state's enforcement mechanism and or make use of credentials that were issued by nation states to do so. So think about your passport, for example. So before we invented databases, you would take out your passport, and it's 1959, you take it out of the drawer at your house, you take it to the airport, you show it to the border agent or otherwise authority figure, and he compares it or she compares it with your likeness and then returns this physical document back to you. So point of that being is, if I wanted to do something nefarious using this particular technology, I have to find out where you live, I have to break into your house, I have to grab this particular instrument. And so that's hard to do. Obviously, that's not true right now, and that's actually, and we just discussed it at length last night with a guy who wrote his doctor thesis on EML procedures. Actually, it was a huge boon to cyber criminals that we created all these kind of EML and otherwise quote unquote identity technologies, because that enabled what they're doing, that by and large enabled them to do identity theft, was actually achieved exactly the opposite of what they wanted to achieve. But point being is, we have the technology today to recreate the scenario that I'm describing.
Do we have the willpower to implement that technology?
It's inevitable, as I said, because it's not only is it ethically the right thing to do, it's simply more efficient, effective, and protective. So it comes back to the number that we cite here a lot. Cybercrime last year exceeded $6 trillion, was larger than most economies, with the exception of the United States and China. And that's by and large an externality of the way we do data storage. And they are specifically a lot of people having access to that information that don't need access to that information, right? That shouldn't have access to the information in the first place, and or the information shouldn't exist in the first place.
Yeah, well, you're saying all the right words, but I'm not so sure about the example you used. I think you pointed to the government as a leader in, changing the paradigm. But I think there was another data breach this week involving the Immigration and Naturalization Service losing control.
Well, the government doesn't. So the particular example in my case would be the particular ISO standard that the DMV is using, for example, to issue driver's licenses. That would be the standard, and then you integrate the standard. It's not the government creating that standard. That's the important part to realize. And fortunately, this is a transnational thing. So one of my volunteer position is that of a board member at a standard setting organization. We set the data exchange standards for the travel space. And so we will push the integration in a very particular way, where it's end-to-end encrypted. It's just a green check mark at the moment in time when you need it, and when you don't need it anymore, that information is simply no longer available. Right? Think about your airport scenario. Well, you need that permission when you're at the airport and for this particular length of time, and then it doesn't have to exist anymore, and you don't want it, right? So as the airline or someone else facilitating that transfer, you don't want to be liable for that information either. So where you have the technology to no longer store it in a database, actually they will jump on that. So there's one leader in Europe specifically, which is the railways there specifically, and that by extension will then carry over to other countries. Again, it's just a more efficient thing to do as well. Because
it seems to me the opposite is occurring in the aviation industry, because now you've got the airlines ask you to upload your passport for international travel. They want to upload an image of it, and they supposedly screen it, review it, and approve it. But then when you get to the airport, the same airline is taking an image of your face as you board the airplane. Instead of checking your passport manually with the gate agent, you're now walking through a acrylic enclosure that scans your face. So you got my biometrics there as well. And then even before you get to that airplane gate, you're walking through TSA, where they're scanning your passport, and if you're using the clear surface, they're scanning your eyeballs. So it seems to me that maybe this is the storm or the before the quiet, but I can't wait for those days that you're speaking of, where they will prefer not to hold this data in separate places.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely at the intersection of where the implementation is iffy, as in most technologists don't know how to correctly implement the technology. It comes back to our usual example of blockchain-based solutions. 9 out of 10 teams don't employ that technology in the way it has been intended to use it, don't recognize the particular function. And unfortunately, you're right that that's true. But ultimately, I think we're going to solve for that. And again, this comes down to, it's simply more efficient, as in if the data ends up in a database anyway, right, then it's going to be exposed to manipulation, it's going to be exposed to errors, it's going to be exposed to exchange and duplication. And as an externality of that, companies will simply have commercial events that are incompatible with their objectives. So if, when, where you can actually do this better. So using the typical example of a non-fungible token. Most data should actually, if it's being created at all, be created as a cryptographic primitive. So where you create the access rights to this data at the moment you're creating the data. And then there's two parties that have access to that. One is the actual owner. So in case of biometrics, it will be you, if it's your biometrics. And one would have a temporary key that's time limited and revocable by you. That's the right way of doing it.
Right.
But again,
There's no doubt about that, but my question is stuffing the cat back in the bag. I mean, these data grabbers are everywhere, from your grocery store to whatever other loyalty program you're using. Even just the minute you whip out a credit card, they're tracking your purchases and assembling your data. And I don't see this stopping, despite the best intentions of the harshest privacy advocates.
No, it's a matter of making it commercially non-viable, right? As soon as you experience a few fines, I mean, the $650 million fine that Facebook.
No, I'm not talking about a few fines. As soon as we start experiencing a lot of fines of everyday businesses that are accommodating this, then we'll start to see it.
Right. That's why my usual call to action here is for anybody who's seeking investment, make it a business model to go after, like make it a business model around these laws, enforcing these laws. There's business models to be had that we discussed in the past. You just have to be very, very specific. A lot of companies that are trying to do data brokerage and privacy agency protection services, they're just taking on way too much, right? It's a dam that you cannot fix at this moment in time. You have to pick the battles that you can win. So you hone in on one particular data set and one particular business model. Jeff and I had very long discussions about that. There is very, very little hope for anybody doing this wholesale for all of your data, right? So you want to identify very specific violations of very specific data. So that could be, the low-hanging fruit here are always the same. If it involves the protection of data of minors, you win, right? As in, deploy a business model around that. And that could be lead generation for law firms that go after these companies that are not employing these protections correctly for children specifically, and then work your way up, right? So that's the same trick that politicians always do, right? As in, whenever they want to kick a law through the door that they think is doing something good, they invoke some big boogeyman.
Well, let me drop this bomb on you. How do you feel about private rights of action? Do you think that would be an effective tool to add to the arsenal?
That should be the default, 100%, right? So that, as far as you can leave government agencies out of the equation, the faster you get change, right? So if actual commercial interest is at stake, and that could be just people wanting to profiteer from the fact that you're abusing my data and make this a sport. Right? That's the way it should be. But by and large, the problems, we're not actually accounting for the real externalities as a starting point. I think what we need to do is that we implement way more forensic tools that are easy to use for people like you and me that just report on these violations. Because right now, the forensic tools that we have are pretty limited in their scope, because they will just tell you things like, oh, we found your username and password that you've been using for a decade in 43 databases. Well, that's not going to help me, right? You want to give.
But how about if your privacy-centric browser like Brave, in addition to identifying the 35 site trackers, was somehow able to report that and document it across a wide population of uses, and there would be your evidence for your government agencies to go after.
100%. That should happen every day. right? So that
It should, but why isn't it? Why isn't that part of the new laws? Again, we're just dealing with theatrics here. If they wanted to create and enforce a law protecting our privacy, it's certainly technologically feasible. But the public interest groups that are supporting the politicians are not going to tolerate that.
well, you know probably much more than I do about how the sausage is made and how data brokers.
Don't look behind the curtain.
So how data brokers have specifically fought certain implementations of these laws and got certain paragraphs kicked out of these laws and regulations that were meant to protect innocent citizens. Right? So just CCPA was written very differently than how it was passed, unfortunately, the California Consumer Protection.
Yeah. Well, there's an incremental chokehold being implemented with each new state regulation we have. California is certainly leading the way, as is the Europeans and now the Australians. So, time will tell. But, you'll see the evidence of a better future when it happens. And, it's easy to point to examples. We use electric light bulbs now instead of candles. We use automobiles instead of horses. Success will come with time, with a long passage of time, and probably a long series of implementations of fines and criminal charges. Maybe it should be a criminal offense to be collecting data in addition to a regulatory offense.
Yeah.
But these things aren't going to happen overnight, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, change never takes time. Change takes leverage and incentives. So and there specifically how you multiply those incentives. So that's why we work a lot on getting developers to see that implementing let's call it data rights solutions into the basis of what you're doing and the architecture of what you're doing is actually the more efficient way to do. Let alone is the right thing to do, is just the more efficient way to do. And that is a position that in most companies is not filled, and or in as much as law firms are being engaged, what we have seen hundreds of times is, and you can probably attest to that lawyers by and large try to explain the letter of the current law to their clients rather than what they should be doing, is which explain to me the objective of this law. And they're specifically in like the cryptocurrency space, right? As much as you know how much I dislike that term. If and when and where you implement the technology as intended, you should have never have exposure, regulatory exposure, because you should never take custody of someone else's funds or someone else's personal identifiable data. You should not put it in. There's profit in there, but as far as I'm concerned, it's not viable. And as far as we are concerned, we're going to fund businesses that make you, a company, the project that's still doing this, a target. And we'll make business models out of you being that target. And this doesn't matter if you're Facebook, if you're Experian, or if you're FTX for that matter. Right? If there was someone doing their job, they would have identified instantly, okay, this is a legacy database company, this is more of the same. Let's dive into that and do a security analysis and see where the assets are actually being hosted, where they're actually being controlled.
Well, yeah, you're going down that rabbit hole again. The wholesale failure of the due diligence paradigm from the venture capital community, specifically in relation to FTX, was just kind of come to the forefront in the past couple of weeks.
Yeah,
nobody asked those hard questions. Well, why? These are professionals. Why didn't they ask the hard questions?
Well, honestly, I wouldn't use that term venture capital loosely with the group that allocated to this particular project, because when we looked at this project and they weren't making data available, we just say pass. That's all we can do. This is just our policy. You don't make this data available that we need to make a decision, so then the decision defaults to no. Apparently that policy hadn't been in place with these entities that ended up allocating to it. Yeah. And I don't call, at that point in time, I don't call it venture capital. Right? So for me, that has nothing to do with investing. That's just speculating. You're throwing something into something that's opaque. of course I will have consequences.
Speculative capital.
I think, guys, I think we might want to step back and give people just a bit of a broader perspective here. Tom and I had this discussion yesterday, and I think it might be good to give to our audience. When we look at things like cryptocurrency, and I think it sort of applies to privacy as well, there are sort of like two ends of the spectrum, right? Let's look at like crypto. Right now, the legacy financial system, and I think you've talked about this a couple of times, Chris, sort of has a big tax on us, something like 24%, right? So everything that we buy and pay for probably costs about 24% more because of all the legacy intermediaries that are in the system, in the current financial system, right? So when you buy a cup of coffee, it costs 24% more because of all the bankers and financial transactions that happen between you and that cup of coffee, right? If we had crypto, like Bitcoin instead, right, it would cost us 24% less. But the problem is that right now with crypto, we don't have any governance at all. So you could potentially lose all your crypto funds, or somebody could steal it because there's like zero governance there. So we got to figure out someplace in between that 24% and that 0% where we've got at least some amount of governance, but not obviously 24%. Maybe it's 3% or 5%, where we have a little bit of regulation and governance in there so that we don't have an FTX scandal and we don't have a lot of these other rug pulls and crap that's going on, right?
I'm chuckling because I don't know where the governance is going to come from. Whose governance are you speaking of?
Well, I mean, hopefully a lot of that can be smart contracts and, build things that are not the kind of governance that we currently have, right? But probably has to be a little bit of laws and oversight from some kind of organization. But I don't know exactly what that answer is, right? But it has to be something, because obviously we can't just self-regulate everything.
Yeah. These questions go down to some very basic societal questions. Yes, a society must govern itself. There has to be rules. There has to be regulatory bodies, and these regulatory bodies will differ geographically, across the world. It could be because people have different standards. Society has different norms. Heck, China has a privacy law, right? And that's just the way the world operates. It's not this tidy little thing that everything works out so well, and it's messy, and it's taken many years. The institutional systems that we have in place today, and yet you've got these characters coming up and say, let's do away with the government. Let's do everything decentralized. We'll operate our affairs by smart contract. Now we're seeing the results of that philosophy, and it doesn't work. And so time will tell how this governance issue progresses, but I think I'd like to make a prediction. Governance is not going to disappear.
No, it's not, but the continued conflation and confusion here is that of rules and laws. And what I mean by that is, so technologies just integrates with actual laws. And what I mean by actual laws is the actual laws are made by physics, by reality. It's the law of gravity.
Those are easy laws to comply with.
No, the point is a different one, as in technology can only integrate with that. And so whatever rules that governments pass, those are directed at people. And I make this example all the time, that there are rules in place that require me to drive 65 miles per hour on the freeway, and I never do. And there's hardly ever consequences. Every couple of years I'll get pulled over and I pay my fine. But as a rule of thumb, I ignore that particular rule. But the laws I cannot ignore. You can ignore gravity, but there's consequences. You always fall flat on your face. So the point, though, is to realize that all technology integrates with actual laws. People integrate with rules to the extent that they find them useful. So, and to the extent that they don't find them useful, they ignore them. And by and large, the rules that we have in place today are not useful, right? So they don't protect anybody because they can't, because they ignore observable reality. They ignore the fact that you quote unquote outlaw something here. Well, it's just gonna move into a jurisdiction that facilitates that, or you're just gonna move it underground. Just like you see with things that people want to buy, right? If there's a large portion of the population that wants to buy quote unquote illegal drugs, well, then all you did is you created a black market that you don't get to tax and regulate, but you didn't solve the problem, made it worse, right? And so what we've seen over and over and over again is the best thing that you can glean from that is that one or two or three or four or five entities will create a scenario where you have regulatory capture and then you enshrine those. And that's how we ended up with this decrepit financial system, that it's purely extractive, that doesn't add any value to the real economy at this moment in time anymore, and that we should have replaced decades ago. Right? It's probably a larger tax than actual taxation to the economy, because it's actually holding us back. It's just like, think the typical example for me is always the same. Think about if you were forced to put stamps on your emails. It would take the US entire GDP in a matter of days, and it would be exhausted if that was the case. And yes, you have spam, like a lot of emails are spam, but the solution to that is not to make rules because they do anything, to say spam is now illegal. Well, that won't do anything, right? And in the context of smart contracts, and tokens are just standardized smart contracts, you can multiply this by infinity, that optionality space, because it's just a way more versatile technology, and it's global by nature. So any discussions that rule makers have about that, or any claims that the SEC makes in terms of crypto regulation, it's childish propaganda, and just also inaccurate from the perspective of Gary Gensler. Actually, no one can determine why control over a set of bytes is being changed from A to B. If I send you 1 Bitcoin right now, then only you and I can determine the legal nature of that transaction. Maybe it was a donation to a cause that you are supporting that I made. Maybe I did it by accident. But if this was a payment or something else of a legal nature, is not something that anybody else but the parties to that transaction can determine. So this whole idea...
The government will determine it, because you're going to file a report along with that.
Again, totally optional, right?
Yeah.
It comes back to, yeah, if you want to follow some nonsensical rules, you can do that. You're free to. But again, it will always come down to, are these sensible rules that people need to follow? It comes back to, there's still countries that outlaw the usage of voice over IP.
Mm. Yeah.
And do you think that people in that country are not using voice over IP? And plus,
so technology is accelerating at a faster rate than we can manage it.
Yes, and it's going to accelerate.
Disrupting.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, right? So the best thing, the first step, government, quote unquote, and again, I'm against this idea of personifying and assigning agency to government and putting it in these terms. I think it's always very, very important to identify the individuals and or interest groups that are behind certain government interventions, because they don't come out of the ether. There is some intent behind that, most often some K Street lobbying group on behest of special interest that actually writes these laws and regulations, which is not a big pet peeve of mine. It should always, always, always be identified who wrote this paper and who paid for having this paper written. It should always be included in that before we even talk about this. Because it's like, okay, if there's a certain law that is entirely paid for the legacy financial, by the legacy financial system, should we give a lot of credence to that? Or should we not be able to just dismiss it wholesale and say, well, we don't consider this part of the democratic process?
I think you're putting forth a very idealistic paradigm of how government should work, because in fact our government is a system of special interests, and it's worked that way for over 250 years. I mean, we've had special interests since day one. It's just worse now, and it's easier to target those special interests because some of the problems are just so egregious. but I don't think it's realistic to expect a neutral government of the people, by the people, for the people, without people coming together to promote their particular interests as a group. That's just kind of the nature of the beast.
Well,
Yeah, but Tom, up until about like 10 or 15 years ago, if you actually could point out to a politician that they were being biased, significantly biased by special interest groups, they would feel remorseful and step down.
I think we just didn't know about it back then.
Well, if you were able to actually have some evidence or something, those people would actually act ethically and leave or be kicked out, by their peers. That doesn't happen anymore. Now they just double down and say, whatever, I'm not leaving, I'm staying.
Well, ultimately, I mean, throughout history, these systems eventually break down, right?
Yeah.
We've seen that over and over again. If you introduce too much bureaucracy and too much centralization, these systems become dysfunctional. And we're kind of seeing this globally on nation states. I mean, we essentially need to protect the nation from the state at this moment in time, to where we created all this regulatory overhead. By and large, it's probably fair to say that half of that has no longer relevance. It was created for a different time. Like things like the Security Acts of the 1930s is like, really? The Model T was the standard transportation mechanism of those days, and we follow those particular rules. But larger point there being is, governments are just functions of societies.
I'm pretty sure back in the day, the Henry Ford Company lobbied and had a lot of influence on various laws to promote the automobile. Same way as the dairy industry promoted the promotion of milk as an essential component of our diet, and that was back in the 50s too. Tim asked the question. Tim asked the question as to whether this could all be traced back to Citizens United, which was the big U.S. Supreme Court case that validated the use of the super PACs. I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I think that's just the latest iteration of it. Maybe I'm too cynical, but I wasn't around back then in the 50s, so I can't really speak from direct experience. But I'm of the opinion that it's always existed. That there was never such a thing as your Jimmy Stewart legislator who was by the people, for the people, of the people. And even he had his special interests in It's a Wonderful Life.
I agree with you, Tom. I think the graft has always been there. The special interest has always been there. But I think when they got caught, they used to always leave. Now they don't.
I don't think they left. Let's welcome Tim. You want to hear what he has to say? You need to unmute yourself, Tim.
I'm just listening. No, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so these are all very fascinating concepts. It's a rabbit hole, whichever way we turn. And it's fascinating to us because we're all into the tech, we're all into the advancement of society by the use of these wonderful new tools. But we're just in two very tumultuous times, which are going to be an extended period of conflict before we figure out how they work. It's like the introduction of the automobile. How do we work the automobile on the same roads as the horse? Eventually we worked it out. And I think that's what we're going to see over the next period of years. And it's up to us, the advocates of privacy, to set forth our positions and to light the path to a most reasonable and proper implementation of the technology. And we're going to be fighting tooth and nail against our opponents that want to move fast and break things. And that's just the nature of society. So we're on the right side of history. We're on the right side of the fence here.
Yeah.
I want to go to sort of one last issue. And we only got a few minutes left, but there's another law that's trying to get passed here in this lame duck session for children. What is it? Actually blanking on the name of the legislation, but it's essentially a new law to update COPA, the Children's Online Privacy Act. It's sponsored by Marsha Blackburn and also a Democratic senator. And it sounds like it's actually pretty good because it's essentially updating COPA and extending those privacy rights to kids up to 18 years old. On the surface, that sounds pretty great. But the two things that bother me about it are the fact that it potentially challenges end-to-end encryption. and it gives a lot of kids, particularly gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender kids, not the ability to be able to look up things they want to on the web because they would have to get parental consent. And so there's some potential problems there with the ability for people that are under 18 to be able to actually use the internet as an information source.
Well, Jeff, you've just opened up another rabbit hole, another Pandora's box that could
Right?
take 2 hours to dig into. I will comment that just in the past week, we've had a couple of instances of harms that have happened to and by youth. So this issue goes both ways. You've got the 10-year-old in Milwaukee yesterday that shot his mother because she wouldn't buy him a virtual reality headset on Amazon. And then on the other hand, I think the California girl that was targeted and catfished by the former law enforcement officer of Virginia who drove across the country and targeted her family. So we've got issues with kids on the internet from many different directions. These kids need to be protected, and we need to be protected from the kids. So any new law you have to look at with a sense of skepticism, and I haven't even seen the law. I have no idea what you're talking about, but to the extent that it resolves, some emergent issues, of course we should jump on it. But again, this is a topic that could easily be for the whole next week's show. Kids stuff on the internet.
Yeah, maybe we should be talking about it next week. But even aside from the the issue with gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender kids, the fact that it potentially makes social media companies weaken end-to-end encryption scares the hell out of me.
Yeah, well, that whole subject goes well beyond this issue. They've been nibbling away at that for a long time. Since I remember when PGP encrypted communication first came out, that was against the law, wasn't it?
Right.
We fought long and hard to have the ability to communicate in private.
We did. And this seems like potentially a law that's a backdoor way to try to get rid of end-to-end encryption.
Yeah. I'm going to work on my smoke signals.
Now, anybody should use end-to-end encrypted tools all the time. Make sure that they actually deliver on what they promise, because a lot of these tools don't. They have servers in the middle. But ultimately, again, I think that we're going to get there by kind of evolutionary forces. What I mean by that, we're just going to literally kill any other model that's out there just by virtue of these models not being efficient, but just by virtue of these models ultimately violating someone's right and someone penalizing you for that. And that's the right thing to do. And since we fortunately live in a global world, it's going to be very hard not to basically apply the best of breed standard across all of your systems, unless you just want to service California and not the rest of the world, or just some other nation states per se, and you want to limit yourself to that. But by and large, what we're talking about are network technologies, so they benefit from network effects.
Yeah.
And currencies are the most interesting one. And so inside of the next 5 years, we'll see a dominant digital bearer instrument that will be widely adopted and serve as the equivalent of voice over IP that we're using right now in value transfer systems. Because the mistake that we often make as people living in scenarios where we have optionality in terms of how we use digital technologies, how we do payments in 15 different ways, is that there's billions of people that don't live under these particular circumstances. And these are the real forcing functions. These are the forcing functions where just the quote-unquote developing nations, a term that I really don't like, will get these innovations first, and they will benefit from the fact that they don't have this technology debt. So maybe they lived under some form of dictatorship, but this dictator just has really crappy technology that's based on paper or some Oracle databases or otherwise inefficient systems. So if when those people have digital land registries that actually use cryptographic primitives, they will be just better off, self-sufficient, and their economy will benefit from that. And as much as it pains me to say that, like China rolling out their digital currency, even though it's clearly a surveillance tool, it will just make their economy more efficient. That's just a matter of technological benefit that you're getting regardless of what your intentions are. But I think that will serve as a good example for us in like democratic societies to do the exact opposite in terms of the implementation. So maybe
there's a lot of lessons to be learned out there. That's for
yes,
sure.
exactly. You learn from the failures, right? You don't learn from your successes much, but you learn from the failures, and ideally you learn from the failures of others rather than repeating them. And I don't think any of us wants to live in a scenario where all of our digital transactions being surveilled all the times. And so I don't think we are really in the minority here. We're just people who realize what the current implementation actually does and how damaging it actually is. And most people only get to experience that if and when it's too late, if some externalities that they experience force them to rethink how they're using technology. So the other example, and everybody should watch this documentary a couple of times a year, is the whole social dilemma thing, where they interview dozens of social media employees who all state, yeah, I don't let my kids use that. Right? And they know the best, right? So we should believe them.
Yeah, I never use my own identity on the internet. It's too valuable. It's too tenuous. I always use somebody else's.
Well,
That's my favorite line.
We're over the top of the hour, so
it was great chatting with you guys. I'm glad I was able to pop on here, and it was a very engaging conversation, and we opened up a lot of rabbit holes.
Yes, we can make a lot of different shows out of this show.
We appreciate you dropping by, Tom.
Yeah.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So we'll
try to do it more often.
Yeah, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Ping us with any topics you'd like to talk about in depth. Jeff and I are working on a larger program right now to educate companies and their employees on the topics that we are talking about. So if you're interested in learning more about that, just email us. Because we want to really make this more scalable, as much as it's interesting to have very nerdy discussions, ultimately the result should be that we have practical tools that people can use on a daily basis to make themselves safer until we change the paradigm altogether, and that's what we're working on long term.
Sounds like a good plan.
With that, thanks everybody for dialing in. We'll see you again in 2 weeks, and I'm gonna play our extra. Take care.